Standing in my black dress beside Marcus's casket, I watched our daughter Victoria lean over to her brother Sebastian and whispered loud enough for half the mourners to hear. Seriously? Mom couldn't even plan a decent send-off for herself. Look at this pathetic turnout. The Riverside Community Center? Really? Her perfectly manicured nails tapped against her designer clutch as she surveyed the modest gathering with barely concealed disgust. When Mrs. Pemberton died last month, they had the Grand Ballroom at the Fairmont. This is just embarrassing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I felt something cold settle in my chest, something that had nothing to do with the October chill seeping through the community center's thin walls. My husband Marcus had been gone for exactly 4 days, and here was our eldest child worried about the social optics of his memorial service. The same daughter who had visited him twice during his 6-month battle with pancreatic cancer. The same daughter who had been too busy with her charity galas and country club meetings to hold his hand during chemotherapy sessions. The morning of Marcus's funeral had started like any other day in the past week since his passing, except it wasn't like any other day at all. I had woken up in our king-sized bed in Millbrook Heights, reached automatically for the space where my husband should have been, and found only cold sheets and the lingering scent of his cologne on his pillow. 53 years old, and I was a widow. 31 years of marriage, reduced to memory, and a funeral program I'd spent hours perfecting at the kitchen table. Marcus had been my anchor, my business partner, and my best friend. We'd built Hartwell Agricultural Solutions from nothing, just 2 college sweethearts with a vision and a borrowed truck. What started as a small seed supply company in rural Millbrook had grown into a multi-million-dollar agricultural consulting firm with clients across 3 states. Marcus handled the technical side, the crop rotation strategies and soil analysis consultations, while I managed operations, finances, and client relations. But our greatest pride had been our children. Victoria, now 32, had graduated from Northwestern with an MBA. Sebastian, 29, had earned his law degree from Georgetown. We had given them every opportunity, paid for the best schools, connected them with influential people in their fields. We thought we had raised grateful, compassionate human beings. The first crack in that illusion had appeared 6 months ago when Marcus received his diagnosis. Dr. Henderson had delivered the news with clinical precision. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, inoperable, 6 to 12 months to live. I had gripped Marcus's hand so tightly I thought I might break his fingers, but he had squeezed back just as hard, his calm voice asking practical questions about treatment options and timelines. When we called the children that evening, their reactions had been telling. Victoria's first question, after a brief expression of sympathy, was whether Marcus had updated his will recently. Sebastian had offered to fly in from Chicago, but when I told him it wasn't immediately necessary, he seemed relieved. Neither of them had asked about pain management, about his emotional state, about what they could do to help during his remaining time. Over the following months, as Marcus fought his battle with characteristic determination, our children's true nature slowly revealed itself. Victoria, who lived just 40 minutes away in the upscale Riverside district, visited perhaps 8 times total. Her visits were brief, uncomfortable affairs where she perched on the edge of the living room sofa, checking her phone frequently and making vague comments about how positive Marcus looked, even as he was clearly wasting away. Sebastian managed even fewer visits, claiming his law practice in Chicago required his constant attention. He sent expensive fruit baskets and flower arrangements, the kind of gestures that looked thoughtful but required no real emotional investment. When Marcus had his worst week in August, barely able to keep food down and too weak to leave bed, Sebastian canceled a planned visit because of a client golf tournament. But it was their attitude toward the business that truly opened my eyes. Marcus and I had always assumed the children would eventually take over Hartwell Agricultural Solutions. We had structured our estate planning around that assumption, with provisions for them to inherit equal shares of the company. However, as Marcus's condition worsened, Victoria and Sebastian began making it clear that they viewed the family business as nothing more than a cash cow to be liquidated. During one particularly painful conversation in September, Victoria had suggested we should start looking for buyers. "Mom, be realistic," she had said, her voice taking on that condescending tone I was learning to hate. "Neither Seb nor I want to move back to the middle of nowhere to run some agricultural business. We have our own careers, our own lives. It makes more sense to sell while Dad can still provide input on valuation." Sebastian had nodded along via video call from his Chicago office, his expensive suit and city backdrop emphasizing how far he felt he had moved beyond our small-town roots. "Victoria's right, Mom. We need to be practical. The agricultural sector is consolidating anyway. It's better to sell to one of the big firms now rather than try to compete as a small family operation." Marcus had said nothing during that conversation, but I could see the hurt in his eyes. This was his life's work they were discussing like a stock portfolio to be optimized. That evening, after the children had hung up, he had taken my hand and said quietly, "Maybe we were too focused on building something for them instead of building something that would make them proud to carry on." The funeral arrangements had been another source of conflict. Victoria had very definite opinions about how things should be handled, but those opinions seemed more concerned with appearances than with honoring Marcus's memory. She wanted the service at St. Catherine's Episcopal, the most prestigious church in Riverside, despite the fact that we had attended the small Methodist church in Millbrook for decades. She lobbied for an elaborate reception at one of the area's upscale venues, complete with a professional catering company and string quartet. When I gently explained that Marcus had specifically requested a simple service at our home church, followed by a reception at the community center where we had held so many agricultural extension meetings over the years, Victoria's face had twisted with something approaching disgust. "Mother, you can't be serious. What will people think? Dad built a successful business. His funeral should reflect that success." I had stood firm, honoring Marcus's wishes, and now I was watching the consequences play out. The Riverside Community Center was indeed modest. Wood-paneled walls, fluorescent lighting, folding chairs arranged in neat rows. But it was filled with the people who had truly mattered to Marcus. Farmers whose operations he had saved through innovative crop rotation strategies. Agricultural extension agents who had worked alongside him for decades. Community leaders who had relied on his expertise during challenging growing seasons. Victoria's whispered criticism had been overheard by several people, including Margaret Chen, our longtime accountant and family friend, who shot me a look of sympathy and barely concealed anger. Margaret had been doing the books for Hartwell Agricultural Solutions since we incorporated 15 years ago. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. She knew exactly how successful the business was, and she also knew how little Victoria and Sebastian had contributed to that success. As the service continued, I found myself studying my children with new eyes. Victoria sat rigidly in the front row, her posture perfect, her black St. John's suit impeccable. But her attention seemed focused on scanning the crowd, perhaps counting familiar faces or assessing the social status of the attendees. Sebastian sat beside her, equally well-dressed, but somehow managing to project an air of someone enduring an obligation rather than mourning his father. The contrast with the rest of the room was stark. Tom Rodriguez, one of our oldest clients, had tears streaming down his weathered face as he listened to the pastor's eulogy. Sarah Mitchell, who ran the county agricultural extension office, clutched a tissue and nodded along with every word about Marcus's commitment to sustainable farming practices. These people understood what we had lost. My children seemed more concerned with getting through the social requirements so they could move on with their lives. The reception following the service was when Victoria's true feelings became impossible to ignore. She had positioned herself near the entrance, greeting people with the practiced smile of someone working a networking event. When old family friends expressed their condolences, she accepted them graciously but briefly, her eyes already moving to the next person in line. When business associates approached to share memories of working with Marcus, she listened with polite disinterest, offering generic responses that revealed how little she actually knew about her father's professional relationships. But it was her conversation with Miranda Ashworth, the wife of Riverside's mayor, that finally pushed me beyond my breaking point. Miranda had approached Victoria with what I could tell were genuine condolences. The Ashworths had known our family for years through various community organizations, but Victoria immediately steered the conversation towards social territory. "Thank you so much for coming, Miranda," Victoria said, her voice taking on an artificially warm tone. "I have to apologize for the venue. Mother insisted on this little community center rather than something more appropriate. You know how the older generation can be about change." Miranda looked genuinely taken aback. "Victoria, this is where your father gave his presentation on water conservation to the city council just last year. I think it's a lovely tribute to have his service here." Victoria's smile tightened. "Well, yes, I suppose there's some sentimental value. But honestly, after everything Dad accomplished, you'd think we could manage something a bit more sophisticated. When the Pembertons had their service at the Fairmont, it really showed how much the community valued Richard's contributions." I felt my face flush with anger and embarrassment. Victoria was criticizing the funeral arrangements to one of the most socially prominent women in the county, comparing her father's service unfavorably to that of a man who had inherited his wealth rather than building it through decades of hard work. But more than that, she was completely missing the point of what this gathering represented. Margaret Chen appeared at my elbow, her usually calm demeanor showing signs of strain. "Helen, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. I followed Margaret through a quiet corner near the kitchen, grateful for the opportunity to step away from the social minefield the reception had become. Margaret had been more than just our accountant over the years. She had become a trusted advisor and friend, someone whose judgment Marcus and I both valued highly. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Helen," Margaret said, her professional composure giving way to genuine emotion. "Marcus was one of the finest men I've ever known." "Thank you, Margaret. That means so much coming from you." She hesitated for a moment, then continued. "I have to ask, are you aware of what Victoria and Sebastian have been discussing regarding the business?" I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" Margaret glanced around to make sure we weren't being overheard, then lowered her voice. "Victoria called my office last week. She wanted to know about the current valuation of Hartwell Agricultural Solutions, the debt structure, the liquid assets. She said she was asking on your behalf, but something about the conversation felt off." My stomach dropped. What kind of questions was she asking? "Very specific ones about how quickly the business could be liquidated if necessary. She asked about tax implications of selling versus dissolving the company entirely. She even wanted to know about the cash flow projections for the next quarter, which seemed odd since she's never shown any interest in the day-to-day operations." I absorbed this information, feeling pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. "Did Sebastian contact you as well?" Margaret nodded grimly. "2 days ago. He claimed he was trying to help you with estate planning and needed detailed financial records. He specifically asked about the company's contracts and whether they included change of ownership clauses that might affect valuation." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. While I had been focused on caring for Marcus during his final months, while I had been planning a funeral that would honor his memory and comfort his friends, my children had been conducting their own parallel investigation into how quickly they could convert their inheritance into cash. "There's something else, Helen," Margaret continued, her voice even quieter now. "I did some research after Victoria's call, just to make sure I could answer any legitimate questions you might have about estate settlement. The business is worth significantly more than I think your children realize. The client base alone, given the long-term contracts and the specialized nature of the services, would be valued very highly by any of the major agricultural consulting firms." "How much are we talking about?"
Margaret named a figure that made me bling in surprise. In the stress and grief of recent months, I hadn't focused on the financial details. But Margaret was right. Hartwell Agricultural Solutions had grown into something much more valuable than even Marcus and I had realized. The problem is, Margaret continued, your children seem to be thinking in terms of a quick liquidation sale rather than a proper business valuation. If they rush to sell, they could easily leave several $1,000,000 on the table. Several $1,000,000. The number echoed in my mind as I watched Victoria across the room, still holding court with Miranda Ashworth and complaining about the funeral arrangements. My daughter was so focused on the superficial appearance of success that she was willing to throw away the substance of what her father had actually built.
I thanked Margaret for the information and returned to my hosting duties, but the rest of the reception passed in a blur of forced smiles and automatic responses to condolences. All I could think about was the growing realization that my children saw Marcus's death not as a tragic loss, but as a business opportunity to be optimized. The final straw came as people were beginning to leave. Victoria had cornered Dr. Patricia Vance, the head of the State Agricultural Extension Service, who had flown in specifically to pay her respects to Marcus. Dr. Vance had been instrumental in several of our largest contracts over the years, and her presence at the funeral was a significant honor. "Dr. Vance, thank you so much for coming," Victoria said, extending her hand with that same networking event energy. "I hope you'll forgive the modest arrangements. Mother has very simple tastes." Dr. Vance, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who had built her reputation on straight talk and practical solutions, looked puzzled by Victoria's approach. "I think your father would have loved this gathering, Victoria. Some of the most important people in sustainable agriculture are here today. The relationships represented in this room are worth more than any fancy venue could provide." Victoria's smile faltered slightly. "Well, yes, I'm sure Dad would appreciate the sentiment, but moving forward, as we transition the business, we'll probably be looking at more professional approaches to client relations." "Transition the business?" Dr. Vance's eyebrows rose. "Are you planning to take over your father's work?" "Oh no," Victoria laughed, and there was something dismissive in the sound that made me cringe. "Sebastian and I have our own careers. We'll be looking for buyers who can really maximize the potential of what Dad built." Dr. Vance's expression cooled noticeably. "I see. Well, I hope whoever takes over understands the importance of the personal relationships Marcus cultivated. That's not something that can be easily transferred or maximized." After Dr. Vance excused herself, I watched Victoria return to Sebastian, who had been networking with some of the younger professionals in attendance. Their body language was animated, conspiratorial, and I had a sinking feeling they were already planning their next moves. The last guests departed around 4 o'clock, leaving just family and a few close friends to help with cleanup. As I packed leftover food and folded chairs, I listened to fragments of conversation between Victoria and Sebastian that confirmed my worst fears. "I talked to that tax attorney Morrison recommended," Sebastian was saying, in a voice he probably thought was too quiet for me to hear. "He says if we move quickly on the sale, we can structure it to minimize the capital gains impact." "Good," Victoria replied, "and I've been thinking about the house. It's way too big for Mom now, and the property value in Millbrook Heights has actually increased quite a bit. We should probably start looking at senior living options that would be more appropriate for her situation." Senior living options? They were planning to sell my home out from under me, the house where Marcus and I had raised our children, where we had celebrated 31 wedding anniversaries, where he had taken his last breath just 4 days ago. Margaret Chen, who had been helping me pack the kitchen cleanup supplies, must have seen something in my face because she moved closer and spoke quietly. "Helen, are you all right?" I looked at my longtime friend and business partner, this woman who had watched Marcus and I build something meaningful and lasting, and felt a resolve settling in my chest that surprised me with its clarity and strength. "Margaret," I said, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me, "I need to ask you a favor." "Anything." "Tomorrow, I want you to call Patricia Morrison, that estate attorney you recommended last year. I need to make some changes to my will." Margaret's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded without question. "Of course. What kind of changes are you thinking about?" I looked across the community center at my children, who were now openly discussing real estate values and tax strategies while helping to stack chairs, and felt the last of my maternal illusions crumble away. The kind that will teach them the difference between building something and destroying it, I said. The kind that will show them what their father's life was really worth. As we finished cleaning up and prepared to leave the community center, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Marcus's diagnosis, a sense of purpose and control. For months, I had been reactive, responding to his illness, to the children's demands, to the overwhelming logistics of loss and grief. But now, for the first time, I was going to be proactive. Victoria and Sebastian had shown me exactly who they were, and I was finally ready to believe them. More importantly, I was ready to act on that knowledge. The drive home to Millbrook Heights was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Victoria and Sebastian had their own cars and their own plans for the evening. Victoria was returning to her house in Riverside, Sebastian to his hotel before flying back to Chicago the next morning. They would probably spend the evening on phone calls with attorneys and financial advisors, planning their strategy for liquidating what they saw as their rightful inheritance. Let them plan, I thought, as I turned into the driveway of the house Marcus and I had called home for 28 years. They were about to learn that some things couldn't be inherited, only earned, and they were about to discover what it meant to truly lose something valuable. The house felt enormous and empty without Marcus, but it also felt like mine in a way it hadn't for months. During his illness, every room had been organized around his needs. The hospital bed in the living room, the medications arranged on every surface, the wheelchair ramp Sebastian had grudgingly arranged to have installed. Now, in the silence left by his absence, I could think clearly for the first time in months. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table where Marcus and I had planned our business strategies for 3 decades. The same table where we had helped Victoria and Sebastian with their homework, where we had celebrated their achievements and consoled them through their disappointments. The same table where we had dreamed of the day they would join us in the family business, carrying forward the values and relationships we had spent our lives building. Those dreams felt naive now, but I wasn't ready to mourn them just yet. First, I had work to do. I pulled out my laptop and began researching estate attorneys in the region, looking specifically for lawyers who specialized in complex business succession issues. Patricia Morrison came highly recommended by Margaret, but I wanted to understand all my options. As I read through attorney profiles and client testimonials, a plan began forming in my mind. Marcus had always taught me that the best business decisions were made not in anger, but in careful analysis of facts and consequences. Emotion gets you started, he used to say, but strategy gets you results. Tonight, I would let myself feel the full weight of my children's betrayal. Tomorrow, I would begin implementing a strategy that would ensure Marcus's life work survived, even if our children weren't worthy of carrying it forward. The phone rang around 9 o'clock. Victoria's name appeared on the caller ID, and I almost didn't answer. But curiosity got the better of me. "Hi, Mom." Victoria's voice was softer than it had been all day, perhaps an attempt to repair some of the damage from her behavior at the reception. "I just wanted to check on you. I know today was difficult." "It was," I replied simply. "I hope you know that Sebastian and I are here to help with whatever you need. The next few weeks are going to be overwhelming with all the estate issues and business decisions." Business decisions. There it was again, the focus on logistics and liquidation rather than legacy and loss. "I appreciate that, Victoria," I said. "Actually, I've been thinking about what you and Sebastian said earlier about selling the business." I could hear the interest sharpen in her voice. "Oh, have you given any thought to timeline? Sebastian thinks it would be good to move quickly while the market conditions are favorable." "I'm meeting with an attorney tomorrow to discuss options," I said, which was true enough. "That's wonderful, Mom. Really smart. Do you want me to sit in on the meeting? I know this kind of legal stuff can be overwhelming, and I do have experience with business transactions." The condescension in her voice was so familiar, I wondered how I had missed it for so many years. Victoria had always assumed she knew better, that her expensive education and social connections made her more capable than her small-town parents. The tragedy was that Marcus and I had enabled that attitude, praising her achievements and overlooking her arrogance because we were so proud of her success. "Thank you for the offer," I said, "but I think I can handle it." There was a pause, then Victoria's voice took on that edge I had learned to recognize as her displeasure with not getting her way. "Mom, I hope you're not going to make this more complicated than it needs to be. I know you're grieving, but business decisions shouldn't be made based on emotion." The irony of receiving that advice from the daughter who had spent her father's funeral complaining about reception venues was not lost on me. "You're absolutely right, Victoria," I said. "Business decisions should be based on careful analysis of facts and consequences. That's exactly what I intend to do." After hanging up, I sat in the quiet house and thought about the conversation. Victoria's eagerness to be involved in the legal consultation revealed just how focused she was on controlling the process of liquidation. She wanted to ensure that her interests were protected, that the sale proceeded according to her timeline and preferences. What she didn't understand was that I had spent 31 years as an equal partner in building Hartwell Agricultural Solutions. I knew exactly what the business was worth, not just in dollars, but in relationships, reputation, and future potential. And I had watched Marcus pour his heart and expertise into making it something that could outlast us both. If Victoria and Sebastian were determined to see their inheritance only in terms of immediate cash value, then perhaps it was time to show them what their father's life work was really worth to someone who could appreciate it. I spent the rest of the evening making notes and researching options. By the time I went to bed, I had the outline of a plan that would honor Marcus's memory while teaching our children a lesson about the difference between inheriting something and earning it. The next morning, I called Patricia Morrison's office and scheduled an emergency consultation for that afternoon. Then I called Margaret and asked her to prepare a comprehensive analysis of the business's current valuation and future potential. Finally, I made one more call that surprised even me with its audacity. "Dr. Vance, this is Helen Hartwell. I was wondering if you might have time for a conversation about the future of sustainable agriculture consulting in our region." The pieces were falling into place. Victoria and Sebastian thought they were inheriting a business to be liquidated. Instead, they were about to learn what it meant to inherit a legacy worth preserving and what happened when they proved themselves unworthy of that inheritance. Marcus had always said that the best lessons were taught through consequences, not lectures. My children were about to receive the most important education of their lives. Patricia Morrison's law office occupied the top floor of the historic Whitmore building in downtown Riverside, a fitting location for someone who specialized in protecting family legacies from those who would squander them. The elevator ride to the 15th floor gave me time to organize my thoughts and steel myself for what I was about to set in motion. Patricia herself was exactly what I had hoped for based on Margaret's recommendation, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 50s who had built her practice on the principle that estate planning should serve the interests of deserving beneficiaries, not entitled ones. Her office walls displayed framed letters of gratitude from clients whose family businesses had survived generational transitions intact and whose values had been preserved even when family members proved unworthy of inheriting them. "Mrs. Hartwell," Patricia said, rising from behind her mahogany desk to shake my hand. "Please accept my condolences on your husband's passing. Margaret Chen speaks very highly of both of you, and she's briefed me on some of the concerns you have regarding your estate planning." I settled into the leather chair across from her desk, noting the way Patricia's attention remained entirely on me rather than checking her phone or shuffling through other files. This was someone who understood that family dynamics could be as complex as any corporate merger, and that the wrong decision made in grief could destroy generations of careful work. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice," I began. "I'm afraid recent events have made it clear that my original estate planning assumptions were fundamentally flawed." Patricia leaned forward slightly, her expression encouraging me to continue. "Margaret mentioned that you have concerns about how your children view the family business. Can you tell me more about what's been happening?" I spent the next hour laying out everything. Victoria and Sebastian's behavior during Marcus's illness, their obvious disinterest in preserving his legacy, their mercenary approach to his funeral, and the conversations I had overheard about liquidating assets and moving me into senior living. Patricia listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, but mostly maintaining the kind of focused attention that made me understand why Margaret had recommended her so highly. When I finished, Patricia was quiet for a long moment, reviewing her notes. Then she looked up and spoke with the kind of directness I had learned to value in business dealings. "Mrs. Hartwell, based on what you've described, your children view your husband's estate primarily as a financial windfall rather than a family legacy to be preserved. Is that a fair assessment?" "Unfortunately, yes." "And your original will leaves them equal shares in both the business and your personal assets?" "That's correct. Marcus and I always assumed they would want to carry on the family business, or at least preserve it as a tribute to his work." Patricia nodded thoughtfully. "The good news is that you have several options for restructuring your estate planning to ensure your husband's legacy is preserved, even if your biological children aren't the ones to inherit it. The question is how far you're willing to go to protect what you and Marcus built together." The phrase, "how far you're willing to go," hung in the air between us. I thought about Victoria's dismissive comments at the funeral, about Sebastian's obvious eagerness to liquidate everything Marcus had spent his life creating, about their plans to sell my home and relocate me to a facility where I would be out of their way while they dismantled everything we had worked for. "Patricia," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice, "I'm willing to go as far as necessary to ensure that Marcus's work survives and continues to benefit the agricultural community he served. If my children can't appreciate the value of what he built, then perhaps they don't deserve to inherit it." Patricia's expression shifted into what I could only describe as professional satisfaction. "In that case, let me outline some strategies that might interest you." Over the next 2 hours, Patricia walked me through a series of estate planning options that I had never considered. The most intriguing involved establishing a charitable foundation dedicated to sustainable agriculture research and education, funded by the majority of my estate and designed to carry forward Marcus's work in perpetuity. My personal assets could be structured to provide me with lifetime financial security, while ultimately benefiting causes that Marcus had cared about deeply. The beauty of this approach, Patricia explained, is that it serves multiple purposes. Your husband's legacy is preserved and expanded through the foundation's work. You maintain control over your assets during your lifetime, and your children receive exactly what they've demonstrated they deserve, which is a modest inheritance that reflects their actual contribution to your family's success, rather than the substantial windfall they're currently expecting. The concept was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Victoria and Sebastian had spent months calculating how to maximize their inheritance from a business liquidation. Instead, they would receive token amounts while the bulk of Marcus's life work was preserved through an institution that would honor his memory and continue his mission. But Patricia wasn't finished outlining options. "There's another approach that might appeal to you, given your concerns about the business specifically. You could transfer ownership of Hartwell Agricultural Solutions to someone who truly understands its value and would preserve your husband's vision." "Transfer it to whom?" "Someone who has demonstrated both competence and commitment to the company's mission. Margaret Chen, for instance, has been intimately involved with the business for 15 years. Dr. Patricia Vance from the State Extension Service clearly understands and respects what your husband accomplished. There may be others in your professional network who would be worthy successors." The idea was breathtaking in its audacity. Instead of allowing Victoria and Sebastian to sell the company to the highest bidder, I could ensure its survival by transferring it to someone who would nurture and expand Marcus's vision. The children would still receive some inheritance, but they would have to watch as the business they had planned to liquidate thrived under new leadership. How would something like that work legally? Patricia's smile suggested she had handled similar situations before. There are several mechanisms. You could establish a succession plan that transfers ownership to key employees over time, similar to an employee stock ownership plan. You could sell the business to a worthy successor at fair market value, with the proceeds going into a trust or foundation. Or you could simply bequeath it directly to someone who would preserve its mission and values. Each option offered its own advantages, and I found myself energized by the possibilities in a way I hadn't felt since Marcus's diagnosis. For months, I had been reacting to circumstances beyond my control. His illness, his death, my children's greed. Now, for the first time, I was in a position to shape outcomes according to my own values and priorities. Patricia, I need to think about these options and probably have some conversations with potential successors before I make any final decisions. How quickly could changes be implemented if I decide to move forward? Emergency estate planning revisions can be completed within a week if necessary. But Mrs. Hartwell, I should warn you that once your children realize what you're considering, they may take legal action to challenge your competency or claim undue influence. We should be prepared for that possibility. The warning didn't surprise me. Victoria's threat to pursue senior living arrangements had already revealed her willingness to override my preferences when they conflicted with her financial interests. If she discovered that her expected inheritance was being redirected to preserve Marcus's legacy rather than fund her lifestyle, she would almost certainly fight back through whatever legal means she could find. What kind of legal challenges might they pursue? They could claim that grief has impaired your judgment, or that you're being manipulated by outside parties who stand to benefit from changes to your will. They might argue that your decision to disinherit them represents a dramatic departure from your established intentions, suggesting mental incapacity. I laughed, the sound sharp in the quiet office. Patricia, my children spent their father's funeral complaining about the venue and discussing real estate values.
If anyone's judgment should be questioned, it's theirs. I understand your frustration, but family courts see these disputes regularly. Adult children who expected substantial inheritances will often claim that any deviation from their expectations represents diminished capacity in the parent. We'll need to document your decision-making process carefully to demonstrate that your choices are rational, informed, and consistent with your values. Patricia spent another hour walking me through the documentation requirements and legal safeguards that would protect my revised estate planning from challenge. By the time I left her office, I had a clear understanding of both the opportunities and risks involved in restructuring my will to reflect my true priorities rather than my children's expectations. The drive back to Millbrook gave me time to process everything Patricia had shared. The option that appealed to me most was transferring the business to someone who truly understood its value, but I needed to identify the right successor. Margaret Chen was an obvious candidate, given her long history with the company and her deep understanding of its operations. But there were others in our professional network who might be worthy of consideration. Dr. Patricia Vance from the State Agricultural Extension Service had built her career on exactly the kind of sustainable agriculture principles that Marcus had championed. Her presence at his funeral and her obvious respect for his work suggested she might be interested in preserving his legacy. There was also Robert Tanaka, the regional director for the Sustainable Farming Initiative, who had collaborated with Marcus on several major projects and shared his vision for environmentally responsible agriculture. But before I could approach any potential successors, I needed to have a clearer understanding of exactly what Victoria and Sebastian were planning. Their phone conversations and private discussions had revealed their general intentions, but I needed more specific information about their timeline and strategy. If they were moving quickly to pressure me into a sale, I would need to move even more quickly to protect the business from their plans. The opportunity to gather that information came sooner than expected. Victoria called that evening while I was reviewing financial documents that Margaret had prepared for my meeting with Patricia. "Hi, Mom. How did your meeting with the attorney go today?" The question confirmed that Victoria was monitoring my activities more closely than I had realized. She had probably called the house earlier and, when I didn't answer, made inquiries about where I might be. The speed with which she had tracked down information about my legal consultation was both impressive and concerning. It went well, I replied carefully. We discussed several options for handling the estate settlement. That's great. Did you talk about the business specifically? Sebastian and I have been doing some research, and we think we've identified some potential buyers who might be very interested. Potential buyers? They had moved from general discussion of liquidation to specific acquisition targets in less than 24 hours. The efficiency was remarkable, and it confirmed that they had been planning this approach long before Marcus's death. What kind of buyers are you talking about, Victoria? Well, there are several major agricultural consulting firms that have been expanding through acquisitions. Mid-America Agricultural Services, for instance, has been very aggressive about buying up smaller regional companies. Sebastian's firm has actually done some legal work for them, so he has good contacts there. Sebastian's law firm had connections to one of the major players in agricultural consolidation. That explained his confidence about finding buyers quickly and his certainty about market conditions being favorable. He wasn't just offering general advice about liquidation, he had specific knowledge about companies that might be interested in acquiring Hartwell Agricultural Solutions. Have you spoken with them already? Only preliminarily, Victoria said, and I could hear the excitement in her voice despite her attempt to sound casual. Sebastian mentioned that a client of his firm might be interested, and they asked him to put together some basic information about the company. Nothing formal, of course. We wanted to talk with you first. Nothing formal, but they had already initiated contact with a potential buyer and begun sharing information about the business. The betrayal was even deeper than I had initially realized. While I had been planning Marcus's funeral and dealing with my grief, Victoria and Sebastian had been conducting due diligence on behalf of prospective acquirers. What kind of information have you shared with them? Just general stuff, annual revenue, number of employees, types of services offered, the kind of information that would be in any preliminary business profile. I doubted it was quite that general, but I didn't want to reveal the extent of my suspicions. Instead, I decided to probe for more details about their timeline and expectations. Have they indicated what kind of offer they might make? Sebastian thinks they'd probably start around $4 to $5 million, but there could be room for negotiation depending on the client base and contract structure. Of course, we'd want to get independent appraisals to make sure we're getting fair value. $4 to $5 million? Margaret's research had suggested the business was worth at least $8 million, and possibly more, given the long-term contracts and specialized expertise that would be difficult for competitors to replicate. Victoria and Sebastian were apparently willing to accept a significant discount in exchange for a quick sale, or they simply didn't understand the true value of what Marcus had built. That seems like a lot of money to make decisions about quickly, I said. Maybe we should take some time to consider all the options. Mom, I understand that this feels overwhelming, but waiting too long could actually cost us money. Sebastian says the market for agricultural services companies is very hot right now because of consolidation trends. But that could change if there's an economic downturn or if regulatory issues slow down the merger activity. In other words, they wanted to move quickly to lock in a sale before I had time to fully understand the business's value or explore alternatives to liquidation. The pressure tactics were subtle but unmistakable, and they revealed a level of strategic thinking that I had underestimated. Victoria, I appreciate that you and Sebastian are trying to help, but I'm not ready to make any major decisions yet. I need more time to understand all the implications. There was a pause, and when Victoria spoke again, her tone had shifted slightly. Mom, I hope you're not going to make this more complicated than it needs to be. The reality is that neither Sebastian nor I have any interest in moving back to Millbrook to run an agricultural consulting business. We have our own careers and our own lives. The responsible thing is to sell while market conditions are favorable and use the proceeds to ensure your financial security. The phrase, ensure your financial security, was particularly galling, given that they had also been discussing selling my house and moving me to senior living facilities. Their vision of my financial security apparently involved liquidating all my assets and putting me somewhere they wouldn't have to think about my needs.
I understand your positions, Victoria. I just need some time to make sure I'm making the right choices. After hanging up, I sat in the quiet house and tried to process what I had learned.
Victoria and Sebastian weren't just planning to sell the business. They had already initiated preliminary discussions with potential buyers and were building momentum toward a quick sale. Their timeline was aggressive, their strategy was coordinated, and their understanding of the business's value was either incomplete or deliberately understated. More importantly, they had revealed that Sebastian's law firm had existing relationships with companies interested in acquiring agricultural consulting businesses. That gave them insider access to potential buyers and possibly insider knowledge about what those buyers were willing to pay. If Sebastian was steering a sale to a client of his firm, he might be prioritizing his own professional relationships over maximizing the value of Marcus's life work. The next morning, I called Margaret and asked her to prepare a comprehensive analysis of recent acquisitions in the agricultural consulting sector. I wanted to understand what companies like Hartwell Agricultural Solutions were actually selling for, as opposed to what Victoria and Sebastian claimed they were worth. I also called Dr. Patricia Vance and asked if she might be available for lunch later in the week. The conversation would require delicate handling, but I needed to explore whether she might be interested in ensuring that Marcus's work continued under leadership that understood and respected his vision. Finally, I called Patricia Morrison and scheduled a follow-up appointment for Friday. If Victoria and Sebastian were moving quickly to pressure me into a sale, I needed to move even more quickly to protect my options. The rest of the week passed in a blur of research, meetings, and careful conversations with people I trusted. Margaret's analysis of recent acquisitions confirmed my suspicions. Agricultural consulting companies with established client bases and specialized expertise were selling for significantly more than Victoria and Sebastian had suggested. Companies comparable to Hartwell Agricultural Solutions had recently been acquired for $8 to $12 million, not the $4 to $5 million Victoria had mentioned. My lunch with Dr. Vance proved even more enlightening. She was genuinely interested in exploring ways to preserve and expand Marcus's approach to sustainable agriculture consulting, and she had several ideas for how the business might be restructured to serve a broader educational mission while remaining financially viable. "Helen," she said over coffee at the end of our meal, "what Marcus built represents 30 years of accumulated knowledge and relationships in sustainable agriculture. That's not something that can be easily replicated or replaced. If there's anything I can do to help preserve that legacy, I'd be honored to be involved." By Friday morning, I was ready to move forward with restructuring my estate planning. Patricia Morrison had prepared several alternative versions of my will, each designed to protect Marcus's legacy from children who saw it only as an asset to be liquidated. The version I ultimately selected was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications for Victoria and Sebastian. The majority of my estate, including my share of Hartwell Agricultural Solutions, would be transferred to a newly established foundation dedicated to sustainable agriculture research and education. The foundation would be managed by a board of directors that included Dr. Patricia Vance, Margaret Chen, and several other professionals who understood and shared Marcus's vision. Victoria and Sebastian would each receive modest cash inheritances of $50,000, amounts that acknowledge their status as my children while reflecting their actual contribution to the family's success. They would also receive personal mementos and family photographs, ensuring that they couldn't claim to have been completely disinherited. The house in Millbrook Heights would be sold, with the proceeds going to the foundation. I would retain lifetime rights to live there, but upon my death, the property would become part of Marcus's educational legacy rather than a real estate asset for my children to liquidate. Patricia had also prepared detailed documentation of my decision-making process, including recordings of our consultations and written statements explaining my reasoning. "Mrs. Hartwell," Patricia said as I signed the final documents, "I have to ask if you're prepared for your children's reaction when they discover what you've done." I thought about Victoria's complaint at Marcus's funeral, about Sebastian's eagerness to liquidate everything his father had built, about their plans to sell my house and relocate me to senior living facilities where I would be out of their way. "Patricia," I said, "my children stopped being my children the moment they decided that their father's death was primarily a business opportunity. What they're going to become now is a lesson in consequences.
The new will was executed and secured within a week of Marcus's funeral. Victoria and Sebastian, meanwhile, continued their increasingly aggressive campaign to pressure me into agreeing to a quick sale of the business. Victoria called almost daily with updates on the interest from potential buyers, while Sebastian sent emails with tax analysis and market projections designed to demonstrate the urgency of moving quickly. Neither of them seemed to notice that I had stopped engaging substantively with their proposals. I listened politely to their presentations and thanked them for their research, but I didn't commit to any timeline or process for a sale. My lack of enthusiasm seemed to frustrate them, but they apparently attributed it to grief and depression rather than strategic thinking. The breakthrough moment came 2 weeks after the funeral, when Sebastian flew back to Millbrook for what he described as a family business meeting. Victoria picked him up at the airport, and they arrived at the house on a Saturday morning with briefcases full of documents and presentations designed to convince me that immediate liquidation was my only reasonable option. "Mom," Victoria said as they settled into the living room, "Sebastian and I have put together a comprehensive analysis of your situation, and we really think it's time to make some decisions." Sebastian opened his laptop and began projecting slides onto the television screen, a presentation that was clearly designed for a corporate boardroom rather than a family discussion. The first slide was titled "Estate Planning Optimization: Maximizing Value Through Strategic Liquidation." "What we've done," Sebastian explained, in the confident tone he probably used with his law firm's clients, "is model several different scenarios for handling Dad's estate. The conclusion is clear: immediate liquidation of business assets provides the highest net present value and the lowest risk profile." The presentation continued for 45 minutes, complete with charts showing market trends, tax implications, and projected returns from various investment strategies. It was impressively professional and utterly soulless, reducing Marcus's life work to a series of financial variables to be optimized. When Sebastian finished, Victoria leaned forward with the expression she probably used in her charity board meetings when she needed to convince reluctant donors to write large checks. "Mom, we know this is a lot to process, but the bottom line is simple. If we move forward with the Mid-America acquisition, you'll receive approximately $4.7 million after taxes and transaction costs. That money can be invested conservatively to provide you with financial security for the rest of your life, plus substantial inheritances for Sebastian and me." $4.7 million. They were still significantly undervaluing the business, either through ignorance or deliberate deception. But more importantly, they were still talking about my financial security and their inheritances as if I were already incompetent to manage my own affairs. "What about the people who work for the company?" I asked. "What happens to them under this acquisition?" Sebastian and Victoria exchanged a quick glance that suggested they hadn't given much thought to the human impact of their liquidation plans. "Well," Victoria said carefully, "Mid-America would probably retain some of the key personnel, at least initially, but they have their own operational structure, so there would likely be some redundancies." Redundancies? They were talking about firing people who had worked with Marcus for decades, people who had helped build the company's reputation and client relationships, as if they were excess inventory to be eliminated. "And what about the clients?" I pressed.
Many of them have worked with us for years because they trust our approach to sustainable agriculture," Sebastian answered with the casual confidence of someone who had never actually worked in the agricultural sector. "Mid-America has a much larger client base and more resources than we do. The existing clients would probably benefit from access to a wider range of services." He had completely missed the point. Hartwell Agricultural Solutions clients didn't work with us because we were large. They worked with us because Marcus had developed specialized expertise and personal relationships that larger companies couldn't replicate. The acquisition would destroy exactly what made the business valuable. But I didn't argue with their analysis. Instead, I thanked them for their thorough research and told them I needed more time to consider their recommendations. The frustration on their faces was obvious, but they couldn't reasonably object to a grieving widow wanting time to make major financial decisions. After they left, I called Patricia Morrison and told her it was time to implement the next phase of our plan. "Are you ready to inform them of the changes to your will?" she asked. "Not yet," I said. "First, I want to see how far they're willing to go to get what they want. If they're going to reveal their true nature, I want to document it thoroughly." Over the following weeks, Victoria and Sebastian's campaign to force a quick sale became increasingly aggressive. They began scheduling meetings with potential buyers without my consent, claiming they were acting on my behalf to expedite the process. Victoria called my doctor to express concerns about my emotional state and my ability to make rational financial decisions. Sebastian contacted my bank to inquire about establishing a power of attorney arrangement that would give him authority over my accounts. Each of these actions was carefully documented by Patricia Morrison, creating a paper trail that would demonstrate my children's efforts to override my preferences and seize control of my assets. If they eventually challenged my revised will in court, we would have substantial evidence of their character and motivations. The final straw came when Victoria arranged for a representative from Sunset Manor, an assisted living facility in Riverside, to tour my house and assess my needs for senior care services. I arrived home from a meeting with Margaret to find a woman in scrubs walking through my bedroom and bathroom, taking notes on grab bars and wheelchair accessibility. "Excuse me," I said from the doorway, "but who are you and why are you in my house?" The woman looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hartwell. I'm Linda Chen from Sunset Manor. Your daughter Victoria asked me to evaluate your home for safety concerns and provide recommendations for appropriate care arrangements." Victoria had not only contacted a senior living facility without my knowledge, she had given them access to my house to conduct an assessment that would support her argument that I was no longer capable of living independently. The invasion of privacy was breathtaking, and the manipulation was sophisticated enough to suggest she had been planning this approach for some time. That evening, I called Patricia Morrison and told her I was ready to reveal the changes to my will. "How do you want to handle it?" she asked. I thought about Victoria's complaint at Marcus's funeral, about Sebastian's presentation treating his father's life work as a portfolio optimization problem, about the woman from Sunset Manor photographing my bathroom to support their case for my incompetence. "I want to call a family meeting," I said. "It's time they learned what their behavior has cost them." The family meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, giving Victoria and Sebastian time to arrange their travel and prepare whatever presentations they thought would convince me to proceed with their liquidation plans. I spent the intervening days making final preparations for what I knew would be the most difficult conversation of my life. Patricia Morrison had prepared copies of all the relevant legal documents, including the new will and the documentation supporting my decision-making process. Margaret Chen had compiled a comprehensive analysis of the business's true value, including comparable sales data that would expose the inadequacy of the offers Victoria and Sebastian were promoting. Their faces remained professionally composed, but I could see the tension building as they realized their strategy of managing my expectations downward had been exposed. "That's interesting research, Mom," Sebastian said carefully, "but you have to understand that these valuations depend on very specific circumstances. Market conditions, client contracts, operational efficiency, management transition planning. The companies that sold for those higher prices probably had advantages that we don't have." Victoria nodded along enthusiastically. "Exactly. And remember, those are gross sale prices, before taxes and transaction costs. The net proceeds would be significantly lower, and you'd still have all the complexity of managing a large lump sum payment." They were trying to salvage their narrative by minimizing the significance of the higher valuations, but their arguments were becoming increasingly strained. More importantly, they were revealing their underlying assumption that I was incapable of understanding financial complexity or making informed decisions about large amounts of money. "That's a fair point about transaction costs and taxes," I acknowledged. "But even accounting for those factors, it seems like the business is worth considerably more than your initial estimates suggested." Sebastian opened his briefcase and pulled out a legal pad covered with handwritten notes. "Mom, I think we need to step back and look at the bigger picture here.
The value of the business is only relevant if you're actually capable of maximizing that value through a sale process. And frankly, that's not something you should be trying to handle on your own. The mask was beginning to slip. Sebastian was no longer pretending to offer advice. He was asserting that I was fundamentally incapable of managing my own financial affairs. Victoria picked up the thread immediately, her voice taking on the firm tone she probably used with her household staff when they failed to meet her expectations. "Mom, we've been trying to be diplomatic about this, but we're genuinely concerned about your judgment lately. The decision to hold Dad's funeral at that little community center instead of somewhere more appropriate, your reluctance to consider the very reasonable offers we've identified for the business, your resistance to exploring senior living options that would provide better support for your needs." Senior living options. There it was, the threat that had been lurking beneath their apparent concern for my welfare. If I didn't agree to their liquidation plans, they were prepared to argue that I was no longer capable of living independently. "And there's something else," Sebastian added, consulting his notes. "I've spoken with your doctor, and he mentioned that you seemed somewhat disoriented during your last appointment. There are also concerns about your driving and your ability to manage the day-to-day responsibilities of maintaining such a large house." I felt a cold anger building in my chest, but I kept my expression neutral. Sebastian had contacted my doctor to gather ammunition for an incapacity argument, and he was now presenting that information as if it supported their position rather than revealing their manipulation. "That's very interesting," I said. "What exactly did Dr. Harrison tell you about my condition?" Sebastian hesitated, perhaps realizing that doctor-patient confidentiality might limit what information he could legitimately claim to have received. Well, obviously he couldn't share specific medical details, but he did express some general concerns about the stress you've been under and how that might affect your decision-making abilities. It was a lie, or at least a significant exaggeration. Dr. Harrison had prescribed mild sleep medication and recommended grief counseling, but he had never expressed concerns about my cognitive abilities or decision-making capacity. Sebastian was fabricating evidence to support his argument for taking control of my affairs. Victoria leaned forward with an expression of manufactured concern. "Mom, we're not trying to take anything away from you. We just want to make sure you're protected and that Dad's legacy is handled appropriately. The responsible thing is to let Sebastian and me manage the business sale while you focus on your health and recovery." The responsible thing. They were now openly arguing that responsibility required removing me from any meaningful role in decisions about my own assets. The business Marcus and I had built together, the house we had shared for nearly 30 decades, the financial security we had earned through 40 years of hard work. All of it should be managed by them because I was apparently too fragile and confused to handle my own affairs. "I appreciate your concern," I said, standing up and walking to the window that overlooked the garden Marcus had tended every spring. "But I think you've misunderstood something fundamental about my situation." Victoria and Sebastian exchanged glances, perhaps sensing that the conversation was not proceeding according to their script. Sebastian closed his legal pad and adopted the patient expression he probably used with difficult clients who refused to accept his professional advice. "Mom, what do you think we're misunderstanding?" I turned back to face them, feeling a clarity and purpose that had been building for weeks. "You're misunderstanding who I am and what your father and I accomplished together. You seem to think I'm some helpless widow who needs to be managed and protected from complex decisions. But I'm the woman who co-founded a multi-million-dollar company, who managed operations and client relations for 30 years, who helped build something that neither of you has ever bothered to understand or appreciate." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock Marcus had bought for our 20th wedding anniversary. Victoria's professional composure flickered slightly, while Sebastian's expression shifted into the focused attention of a lawyer recognizing that negotiations had taken an unexpected turn. "Furthermore," I continued, "you're misunderstanding what your father's legacy means and what you're actually entitled to inherit from him." I walked back to the coffee table and opened the folder Patricia Morrison had prepared. The new will was on top, its legal weight evident in the formal language and official notarization. Both Victoria and Sebastian stared at the document with the kind of alarm that comes from recognizing a game-changing development they hadn't anticipated. "What is that?" Victoria asked, her voice tight with sudden apprehension. "It's my new will," I said, simply. "The one I had prepared after observing your behavior over the past several months, including your performance at your father's funeral and your subsequent efforts to liquidate everything he worked to build." Sebastian reached for the document, his legal training taking over as he tried to assess the scope of what I had done. His face went progressively paler as he read through the key provisions, and I watched him realize that their entire strategy had been built on assumptions that were no longer valid. "Mom," he said carefully, "what exactly have you changed? I've ensured that your father's legacy will be preserved and continued by people who actually understand and respect what he accomplished. The majority of my estate, including my share of Hartwell Agricultural Solutions, will go to a foundation dedicated to sustainable agriculture research and education." Victoria snatched the will from Sebastian's hands and began reading frantically, her eyes widening as she processed the implications. "This says Sebastian and I each get $50,000. $50,000? Mom, that's less than I spend on vacation in a year. It's considerably more than you've contributed to your father's success. And it's exactly what you've demonstrated you deserve through your actions over the past several months." Sebastian had recovered his composure enough to shift into legal analysis mode. "Mom, we need to talk about this rationally. This will represents a dramatic departure from your previous estate planning, and it was prepared during a period of emotional distress following Dad's death. Any court would question whether you were competent to make such significant changes." The threat was now explicit. If I didn't reverse the changes to my will, they would challenge my competency in court and seek to have my decisions overturned by claiming I was mentally incapacitated by grief. "That's an interesting legal theory, Sebastian," I said, reaching for another folder. "But I think you'll find that Patricia Morrison was very thorough in documenting my decision-making process." I spread out the audio recordings, written statements, and professional evaluations that Patricia had compiled over the past month. The documentation was comprehensive, demonstrating that my choices were rational, informed, and consistent with my lifelong values. More importantly, it included detailed records of Victoria and Sebastian's behavior and statements that had motivated my decisions. "For instance," I said, selecting one of the recordings, "here's the conversation where Victoria complained about your father's funeral reception being held at a pathetic venue instead of somewhere more prestigious. And here's the recording of Sebastian explaining how Mid-America Agricultural Services would probably eliminate most of our employees as redundancies after an acquisition." Victoria's face had gone white, and Sebastian was staring at the recordings with the expression of a lawyer realizing his clients had been building their case on a foundation of documented misconduct. "You recorded us?" Victoria whispered. "I documented your priorities and your character," I corrected, "just as any reasonable person would do when making important decisions about the future of a family business and the people who depend on it." Sebastian made one final attempt at legal intimidation. "Mom, even if you have recordings, you can't just disinherit your children because you disapprove of their business judgment. Family courts recognize that estate planning decisions made during periods of grief are often irrational and should be reversed." "You're absolutely right that courts examine estate planning decisions made during grief," I agreed. "That's why Patricia Morrison also arranged for me to be evaluated by Dr. Amanda Foster, a geriatric psychiatrist who specializes in assessing decision-making capacity in elderly clients." I handed Sebastian another document from Patricia's folder. Dr. Foster's evaluation concluded that I demonstrate excellent cognitive function, sound judgment, and decision-making abilities that are entirely consistent with someone of my education and professional background. She specifically noted that my choices reflect rational analysis of family dynamics rather than impaired thinking due to bereavement. The psychiatric evaluation was the final nail in the coffin of their legal strategy. They could no longer credibly argue that I was incompetent or that my decisions were the product of grief-induced irrationality. The changes to my will were legally sound,
professionally documented, and supported by expert testimony about my mental capacity. Victoria and Sebastian sat in stunned silence, apparently trying to process the collapse of their carefully planned campaign to inherit and liquidate Marcus's life work. The confident presentation they had prepared lay forgotten on the coffee table, its charts and projections suddenly irrelevant to a conversation that had moved far beyond their assumptions about my capabilities and intentions. "There's one more thing you should know," I said, walking to the phone. "Dr. Patricia Vance from the State Agricultural Extension Service is standing by to discuss the foundation that will be carrying forward your father's work." I dialed the number Patricia Vance had provided and activated the speakerphone. Her voice filled the living room with the kind of professional authority and genuine enthusiasm that Marcus had always brought to discussions of sustainable agriculture. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Hartwell. I understand you'd like me to explain the plans for the Marcus Hartwell Foundation for Sustainable Agriculture." Victoria and Sebastian listened in growing dismay as Dr. Vance outlined the foundation's mission, governance structure, and plans for expanding Marcus's consulting work into a comprehensive educational and research initiative. The foundation would preserve not just the business relationships Marcus had built, but also his approach to environmentally responsible farming and his commitment to supporting agricultural communities across the region. The board of directors will include Margaret Chen, Robert Tanaka from the Sustainable Farming Initiative, and several other professionals who worked closely with Marcus over the years. We're planning to establish scholarship programs, research grants, and continuing education opportunities that will ensure Marcus's vision continues to influence agricultural practices for generations to come. When the call ended, the living room felt heavy with the weight of everything that had been revealed and everything that had been lost. Victoria and Sebastian had come expecting to finalize arrangements for liquidating their father's legacy. Instead, they had learned that their inheritance had been reduced to token amounts, while Marcus's life work was being preserved and expanded by people who actually understood its value. "Mom," Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you can't do this to us. We're your children." "Yes," I replied, "you are my children, and that's exactly why this is so heartbreaking." I sat back down across from them, feeling suddenly exhausted by the emotional weight of the confrontation. "Victoria, Sebastian, your father and I spent 30 years building something meaningful. We thought we were building it for you, creating a legacy you would be proud to inherit and continue. Instead, you saw his death as an opportunity to cash out and move on with your lives." Sebastian made one last attempt at negotiation. "Mom, if this is about preserving Dad's work, we can restructure the sale to include provisions for continuing his programs. Mid-America might be willing to maintain some of the sustainable agriculture consulting if it's a condition of the acquisition." The offer revealed just how completely he had missed the point. Sustainable agriculture consulting was not a program that could be maintained as a subsidiary of a large corporation. It was a philosophy, a relationship-based approach to farming that required the kind of personal commitment and specialized knowledge that Marcus had spent decades developing. "Sebastian, the fact that you think your father's life work can be preserved as a program within Mid-America Agricultural Services tells me everything I need to know about how little you understand what he accomplished." Victoria tried a different approach, her voice taking on the pleading tone she had used as a child when trying to avoid consequences for misbehavior. "Mom, please don't do this. We made mistakes, but we can learn from them. Give us another chance to prove that we can honor Dad's memory." I looked at my daughter, this woman who had complained about her father's funeral reception being insufficiently prestigious, who had contacted senior living facilities to assess my competency for independent living, who had spent his memorial service networking with other attendees rather than mourning his loss. "Victoria, you had 32 years to learn about honoring your father. The time for second chances ended when you decided his funeral was an embarrassment rather than a celebration of his life." They stayed for another hour, alternating between legal threats, emotional appeals, and attempts at negotiation. But the fundamental dynamic had shifted irreversibly. They were no longer managing a helpless widow's financial decisions. They were confronting the consequences of their own choices and character. When they finally left, Victoria's parting words were delivered with a coldness that revealed the person she had truly become. "This isn't over, Mother. We'll fight this will, and we'll make sure everyone knows what kind of woman abandons her own children." Sebastian was more professional in his farewell, but no less threatening. "Mom, you should know that we've already made significant financial commitments based on the expectation of inheriting Dad's estate. If you proceed with these changes, you could cause serious problems for both of us." I watched their cars pull out of the driveway and disappear down Millbrook Heights Boulevard, carrying my children away from the family home where they had been raised and toward whatever futures they could build without their parents' support. The silence they left behind was profound, but it was not empty. It was filled with the possibility of Marcus's work continuing under leadership that would honor his vision rather than liquidate it for short-term gain. Over the following months, the Marcus Hartwell Foundation for Sustainable Agriculture became a reality. Dr. Patricia Vance left her position with the State Extension Service to become the Foundation's first executive director, bringing with her a network of researchers and educators who shared Marcus's commitment to environmentally responsible farming. Margaret Chen continued managing the financial operations, ensuring that the transition preserved the business relationships and client trust that Marcus had spent decades building. The foundation expanded beyond simple consulting services to include educational programs, research initiatives, and policy advocacy work that amplified Marcus's impact far beyond what he could have achieved individually. Young farmers throughout the region began receiving scholarships to study sustainable agriculture techniques. Research grants funded studies of innovative approaches to soil conservation and water management. Policy papers developed by the foundation influenced state and federal agricultural regulations in ways that supported small farmers and environmental protection. Victoria and Sebastian, meanwhile, faced the financial consequences of their assumption that they would inherit millions of dollars from their father's estate. Victoria's lifestyle had been built on the expectation of substantial inheritance, and she was forced to sell her house in Riverside and significantly reduce her social activities. Sebastian's law practice suffered when he had to focus on personal financial problems rather than client development, and he eventually left his Chicago firm to work for a smaller practice that offered more modest compensation but greater job security. They did attempt to challenge the will in court, as Patricia Morrison had predicted they would. Their legal arguments focused on claims of undue influence by Dr. Vance and emotional incapacity resulting from my grief over Marcus's death. However, the comprehensive documentation Patricia had compiled, combined with Dr. Foster's psychiatric evaluation and the recorded evidence of Victoria and Sebastian's own statements and behavior, made their case untenable. The judge who heard their challenge was particularly unimpressed by their argument that I had been manipulated by outside parties who stood to benefit from changes to my will. The foundation's board was composed of volunteers who received no financial compensation, and its mission was clearly aligned with values I had shared throughout my marriage to Marcus. In contrast, Victoria and Sebastian's attempts to pressure me into a quick business liquidation, their contacts with senior living facilities, and their documented statements about eliminating employees as redundancies painted a picture of adult children who had prioritized their own financial interests over their father's legacy. The will was upheld in its entirety, and Victoria and Sebastian were ordered to pay the court costs associated with their unsuccessful challenge. Their $50,000 inheritances were reduced by legal fees, leaving them with token amounts that barely covered their attorney expenses. 5 years after Marcus's death, the foundation had grown into one of the region's most respected agricultural organizations. Its annual conference attracted farmers, researchers, and policymakers from across the country, all drawn by the innovative approaches to sustainable agriculture that had been Marcus's passion. The consulting services continued to thrive under professional management, serving both the original client base and new farmers who sought environmentally responsible approaches to agricultural production.
I remained involved with the foundation as chair emeritus, attending board meetings and speaking at educational events about Marcus's vision and the importance of preserving family legacies through institutions that reflect core values rather than simply transferring wealth. My role was largely ceremonial, but it provided me with the satisfaction of seeing Marcus's work continue to influence agricultural practices years after his death. Victoria and Sebastian gradually rebuilt their lives, though their relationship with me never recovered from the events following their father's funeral. Victoria found employment with a nonprofit organization focused on community development, work that seemed to provide her with more meaningful purpose than her previous focus on social status and luxury consumption. Sebastian joined a small law practice that specialized in representing family farmers and agricultural cooperatives, perhaps developing some appreciation for the sector his father had served. They sent Christmas cards and remembered my birthday, but our interactions remained formally polite rather than genuinely warm. The damage caused by their behavior during Marcus's illness and death had created a gulf that could not be easily bridged, even as they seemed to mature into more thoughtful and responsible adults. Sometimes I wondered whether I had been too harsh in restructuring my will so dramatically. The maternal instinct to forgive and support one's children never entirely disappears, even when those children have demonstrated fundamental character flaws. But then I would attend a foundation event and see young farmers implementing sustainable practices they had learned through Marcus's educational programs, or I would read research funded by foundation grants that advance environmental agriculture techniques, and I would remember why I had made the choices I did. Marcus's legacy lived on, not through biological inheritance, but through institutional commitment to the values and vision he had championed throughout his career. The foundation ensured that his influence would extend far beyond what he could have achieved individually, touching agricultural communities and environmental practices in ways that would continue long after everyone who knew him personally had passed away. The house in Millbrook Heights remained my home, though it felt different without Marcus and without the assumption that it would someday be passed down to Victoria and Sebastian. Instead, it became a gathering place for foundation events and a quiet retreat where I could remember 31 years of marriage and partnership with a man whose true memorial was not a funeral reception, but a living institution dedicated to the principles he had lived by. On quiet evenings, I would sit in the garden Marcus had tended and think about the choices that had led from his funeral to the foundation that bore his name. The path had been painful, requiring me to confront the reality that my own children valued money more than meaning, inheritance more than legacy. But it had also been purposeful, ensuring that the most important parts of Marcus's life would continue to influence the world long after his death. Victoria had been wrong about one thing at the funeral. The reception at the Riverside Community Center had not been pathetic or embarrassing. It had been exactly what Marcus would have wanted, a gathering of people whose lives had been touched by his work and who understood the value of what he had contributed to their community. The foundation that grew from that gathering became his true memorial, more lasting and meaningful than any expensive funeral reception could have been. In the end, I had learned that some legacies are too important to be left to biological inheritance. When children prove themselves unworthy of their parents' life work, it becomes necessary to find other ways to ensure that meaningful achievements survive and continue to benefit the world. The pain of disinheriting Victoria and Sebastian was real and lasting, but it was outweighed by the satisfaction of knowing that Marcus's vision would continue to influence agricultural practices and environmental stewardship for generations to come. The foundation was his true inheritance, and it would endure long after all of us were gone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.